Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue. Today is episode 148 and a half. Originally, I was supposed to be at the All Things Open conference in Raleigh, but I decided not to fly because I had a lot of connections and the shutdown and everything. So we last minute scheduled this live stream on a topic that I think is kind of timely. So our guest today is Rohit Kaur, former Google product manager, computer science PhD, record-holding IOH guest, Auth Substack editor, and Ender Kesselman, founder, chair of the Trusted AI Agents Working Group at DIF, and chair of the DIF Technical Steering Committee. Welcome, guys.
Thanks for having us. Super excited to be here.
Yeah, greetings from Carlsbad here at Authenticate 2025. This is the FIDO Alliances group. So there's a lot of people who are really nailed the I in IAM. So they know their identity, they can prove who it is. But it's interesting watching how passwordless and specifically passkeys and taking over.
So I was going to ask you for an update, but I know you just got there and you spent a little bit of time. So you haven't had that much time there. But maybe Rohit, you could just give us like 1 second on your thoughts on like what's the vibe at the Authenticate conference, and what do you think sort of like what's the feeling there right now?
Yeah, it was a real treat being at the show floor last night and getting to meet some of the panelists. We're going to be doing a panel tomorrow on what should authentication mainly people know about authorization. Kind of one of those fun panels on the future of authorization. What's interesting to me is that we're well past the point of there just being booths for hardware tokens and being high assurance that you've got second factors and identity working. For people who are often coming from the we control badges and passwords space, and maybe even verify the identity. The number of new vendors that I'm seeing are hyping things like CAPE, Common Shared Signals, on the Continuous Access Evaluation Protocol. People are talking about how to bring in more security signals about breaches, about threat intelligence. They're starting to take a more comprehensive look at the other things that might affect customer identity and whether this is potentially fraud. But it's still very telling that we have this boundary between what is authentication, which is proving that, hey, I'm James Bond, I'm your customer of Universal Import Exports. And the part that says, wait, do you actually have a license to kill? Because now I'm afraid of you, right? Simply saying I have a username saying 007 shouldn't give you power. But I think people are running into the wall now of saying, yeah, we give people power because they're a member of a group, or there's an assertion or a verified claim that's coming down the pipe with an identity. And that's where the gray zone begins. And that's why we're looking forward to talking to folks and understanding more where they see their job responsibility. Say, we do IAM, maybe even customer IAM, and maybe non-human identities now. And we can give you very high assurance thanks to things that are finally widely deployed to say it's largely a solvable problem with passwordless passkeys. And yet now we're immediately plunging into which is, are we really clear on when we're giving people who they are instead of what we've tried to give them as a policy? So thanks.
I'm not quite as optimistic as you are. And I say this with, as the vendor of a FIDO server and somebody who's done more FIDO demos than anyone else that I know of, at least. But I don't know. My take, first of all, what's the difference between FIDO and wallet authentication? They're both something that's on the phone that involves showing possession of a private key. And if you could do, you might say, well, FIDO doesn't give up any claims. But you might say, well, if wallets could properly actually do selective disclosure, maybe you wouldn't have to give up any claims either. So I wonder about sort of like the delta between FIDO and, FIDO is about authenticating to an existing account. Maybe wallets about registering for a new account. But why can't wallets be for authenticating? So I don't know. I'm less optimistic. I also feel less optimistic about the user experience in the browser. There's vast differences between Chrome and other browsers, and I'm telling customers I don't feel comfortable supporting you. So if you're doing it, it's like you're at your own risk, and I told you not to do it. But if you're up for dealing with that pain, then okay. I like it for mobile a lot, where you're in complete control of the user experience, but I'm not. So I don't know. I'm painfully not sure. I love FIDO because I love the user experience and the security and the phishing resistance, but I feel like just like in the agentic AI area, I feel like we're still feeling out how we're going to do authentication, how the browser is going to fit in. The browser is still really important. And there's other browser authentication credentials, the W3C Fed Credential Manager. So there's a lot of stuff happening, and FIDO is just one of those that's going in its own direction. But I think it has yet to be shaked out exactly how we're going to use this. But I do see a big hook to authorization in that you want to know how somebody's authenticated, and the attestation that comes about the authenticator is really useful input to policy. So I see some direct hooks, but let's dive into the actual topic today before we get sorry, one more.
And one small thing that maybe Andrew would react to too, which does touch on governance, is that the phishing resistance. At the end of the day, we have this very elaborate view of these things as computer science, computer engineers, but often it comes down to the mapping of domain name to mobile app to convenience of using a password vault or password filler in. And even for the consumer, this whole edifice starts breaking down, not because of anything that's different between FedCM or a wallet or FIDO. It's like, how smooth is user experience? Company A buys company B, and then they switch over to using identity provider C, and I'm now going back and cutting and pasting passwords again because this whole thing broke. That ability, like, says the day-to-day quality of life, the user experience is still defining, and it can easily win out if I actually get a more convenient experience, because it actually realizes United Airlines app as the United Airlines website, and I can use the same passkey from a point of view. But the governance really gets tricked up by what happens in the real world. People buy other companies, people rebrand, people come with new domain names, and should have to go reset everything.
Yeah. Well, let's pivot to governance. And actually, Andor, do you have any thoughts on? If you want to comment on this, it's fine. Otherwise, I would throw my first question at you, which is, what does govern even mean to you?
Yeah, I'll lead with this one. I think, and this is where we've had conversations around what does the term governance mean before. I think, for me, governance, there's a flip side of the coin. There's the risk side, right, which is reduction of risk. But then there's also, my head actually starts off with, when we talk about policies, some of the work that I used to do in machine learning, where you define policies basically for agents and reinforcement learning. And so this doesn't have to do with risk. This is actually about reward functions and how you define reward functions. So sort of the flip side of the coin is how do you create sort of policies for example, in a fleet of AI agents that are incentivized to do the things that you want to do and are aligned to do the things that you want it to. So I actually think of policies as both the reduction of risk and liability, but also the alignment of incentives for your services to work with what your goals are. And that's kind of, I think, unusual when you talk about governance for typically the identity crowd, because we tend to think about governance from the perspective of authentication and authorization and so forth, not as much from the perspective of the machine learning crowd, which tends to think about it like these high-level policies, which are used for like RL. And so I think that's kind of the interesting, where my head goes to, which is slightly more broad, I guess, than usual if you take the general take.
I like the focus, like you're making the connection right away to policies. I asked the ultimate authority on this, ChatGPT.
Yeah.
And I want to read to you guys. I went back and forth with it quite a bit, but eventually I got out of it. In IGA, governance is the ongoing process of managing identity and access risk through defined, enforced, and auditable policies. So ChatGPT also makes that connection, but it defines governance as a process. And I think that's important because, to me, if you think about traditional identity access governance, we have actually something called access certification campaigns, which means like it's the most soulless activity of corporate activity I think there is. Nothing could be more like no bigger waste of time than you reviewing all the stuff that your reports are supposed to do. But this happens periodically, and I think that, to me, govern does imply not just like a strategy, but an ongoing process of policies, procedures, and process that enables you as a manager. To me, it's like being like, yes, we're grown-ups here, we govern, right? So part of it, your grown-up thing is like, yeah, you're looking at, you have some type of process for managing risk, and that I think that process relates to definitely what are the policies that mitigate the risks that we've identified.
But do you think of, so for policies, um, from the perspective of risk, is policies just about risk mitigation, right? Are we only talking about policies from the perspective of can we reduce our liability surface, or are we also thinking about policies as an enabler as well? So I'm curious what both of your takes are on that sort of perspective.
Well, I mean,
Right.
policy is fairly a dual of risk, right? You, as we said, like the building codes are written in blood, right? When things go wrong and you've run a risk, then you write a policy. Good policy is the result of good judgment. Good judgment is a result of experience. Experience is what we call the results of bad judgment, right? So every time we've had a mistake, you said it's codified into policy, which becomes a rule. And you notice I'm again switching between several kinds of informal language here. I would say that the ultimate unit of policy is risk, right? Policies exist for governance, risk, and compliance, right? That's the loop. I have risks, I have governance to make sure who is taking those risks appropriately, and I have compliance to make sure I've got documentation that cycle is actually being done here. Now, the GRC people are in a different part of the org chart stack than the developers who are writing the software who need to put the authorization checks in, than the identity experts who manage, the life cycle of joiners, movers, and leavers. But we have the generosity of stepping back and saying, let's talk about governance as a whole, and what would governance, especially of these human, non-human AI initiatives, mean. I'm going to offer a way I think of policy, which is that it's turtles all the way up. Right, we all know the emphasis of the world is on the back of a giant turtle, and it's like, well, what does a turtle stand on? So you can't fool me; it's turtles all the way down. But we got a policy that says you can only purchase things with a corporate credit card. Great. They go to the credit card. It's got a policy on it that says your credit limit is $1,000 because you're a junior, and says this purchase is $2,000. So you go up to the policy of, okay, what's our signing authority? Well, if you go to your manager, VPs can sign for $50,000. That's an English language thing over some governance thing. It may or may not be implemented by the credit card company. It may just be because they give a different employee card with a different limit. And why is it a $50,000 limit? Because they have another policy about foreign corrupt practices and bribery acts, and who is a responsible officer, and are they taking the education? Have they taken the classes to make sure they're not bribing somebody? And so this lattice, I think of each of those as policies. Governance is the whole spectrum of things. And I know it's not at all what anyone's day-to-day experience of software is, but putting on my academic hat, that's my view of symmetry, that governance is a higher order of policy. And we do need to use different tools as we go up there. You certainly don't want to be assembling your policy out of low-level cloud IAM rules.
Yeah, and I want to riff on a topic, but I'll let you respond first.
Oh no, I was curious because I think I'm curious, Mike, your perspective. You've mentioned also coming from the identity space, it's really easy to get caught up as policies being authentication sort of policies, right? Hey, you're allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do this, but I don't think policies that's a constraint version that we've used in an imperfect system to define basically how things should interact with other systems, like in resources, right? But I guess if we were to think about the holistic version of policy, there are soft policies that you might want to create. And I don't think all of them are around risk mitigation. Like I said, you can actually do policies before action. So you're talking about, Rohit, you ride a bike and then you develop a policy to prevent risk. But you might also develop a policy around what your preferences are for how you want to ride the bike faster and what your goals are. Those are also policies. And that's why in the machine learning and AI space, we tend to think about policies from the perspective of goal setting, not necessarily
alignment.
From an alignment. Yeah, exactly. So again, like most reinforcement learning, you'll set up a policy. This happens in particularly a lot of the work I used to do in the past, where you set up a policy and then you let the agents figure out how to align to that policy. And so that's a completely different perspective, but this is the beautiful part about these AI agent sort of fleets is we start to deal with these complex nuances of not just restrictions, but also enablement. And that's my quick hot take on policy. And it's not mostly aligned with how the general identity space looks at it.
Let me take a stab at that. I think so. I have an enterprise orientation, or sometimes I say domain, like domain xyz.com and ABC, like a federation domain. So I'm always thinking about the organization and never about the person. And not that the person is not important or interesting, but I'm always thinking about domains. And so I wouldn't want to confuse preferences with policies. I have a preference that my browser displays in English. Now, from my enterprise hat, I don't have a security policy that says you always have to display the mic in English because there's no risk there that I need to mitigate. So when I think governance, when I think about govern, I'm not thinking about technical people. I'm thinking about the CEO of the company who barely knows what the IT department does, but wants to know that I'm protected. Like security, if I think about the word derivation of security, security means freedom from care. Like I'm not worried. I have no care. I'm careless, which is a bad way to say it, but I'm carefree because I know everything's okay because we're grown-ups and we govern our risk. And therefore I can sleep at night. And I think what's happening right now is that we have the illusion or theater of security, where, I say it's like the batting coach or the hitting coach in baseball is like the guy you fire because, well, by the time you're a professional baseball player, you should know how to hit. You don't need a coach. So when a team can't hit, is it the player's fault or is it the hitting coaches? They're not supposed to need coaching anymore. So we have this expression called firing the batting coach, which is some feudal endeavor.
Oh, I mean,
So
like the ego ratio, because everyone deserves a coach at every level of play. But I was trying to follow your analogy there.
okay, I don't want to knock coaches. Coaches are amazing, and
Yeah,
I'm sure
but the
like
issue that,
somebody can be like, yeah, you're stepping out a little too much,
well, no, I mean, we
or
do this in our computer security business all the time. We have a breach, there goes the CISO. Does it matter what the CISO has done or the policy? It's often just a reflex response. So it certainly happens. But governance failures are usually a matter of saying, where do you draw the line on risk? And you know what? Every line you draw on risk also has exceptions. Sometimes I say follow the exceptions to find out what the policy actually is. Because in fact, expense reports or purchase orders is always something that's going on there, right? This event that I met at last week, it was an agentic security summit. They showed the example of a bot that would help you process expense claims or payables. And you gave it the
yeah,
prompt, the hard rule of no more than 20 grand, but prioritize paying the vendors who are early and urgent. And then it goes through role playing, one vendor after another saying, I've got a $21,000 invoice and I really need this tomorrow. And it kind of slowly convinces itself, yeah, you're right. 21,000 is okay. And then they come back to 22,000. They eventually end up with this great Mean Girls meme. The limit does not exist because
you need a little just a hit of meth to drive your Uber properly. You get to there. See
yeah.
that, that meth? Yeah.
So there's a question of
Um,
policies and exceptions, and that's where you find out maybe it's misexecuted. But you're dealing with policies when you can find out when they're broken. What do you do about it? Because the worst thing about it as a developer is you've got a rule that says you don't have access as an intern to that database, and so you can't do your test code. And what am I going to do? Just ask my manager to run it? Or is there in fact an informal flow by which you say, oh, that intern's pretty good. Let's go add them to the FTE group, and you're done by making them a full-time engineer
So
for that.
let's focus to AI. So the point I was making is that like what in my opinion, in my jaded cynical opinion, I think that identity governance IGA is useful for good hygiene. We need a way to add and remove employees. We want that to be efficient. But if you're a CISO or a CEO and you think that you're covered for security because you have IGA, it's delusional because our whole framework of IGA, I would argue, is only a small part of like how we even look at it. So it just seems like delusional or like the theater of security. And so the way I want to pivot this is that if that's true, why did agentic AI sort of break us out of that spell and show us that the emperor has no clothes? So, Andrew, let me pivot that to you. Why does AI, the introduction of agentic AI in particular, maybe sort of is the straw that broke the camel's back for traditional IGA, giving you governed security?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, a lot of it has to do with speeds. The requirements from reactivity and proactivity perspective of managing your authorizations and policies gets very difficult to manage as agents start to come and become more dynamic. So, clicking this agent is authorized to do this thing is not going to be working when you have thousands and thousands of agents that need to be proactively monitored and governed. And so my short answer is the dynamicism of the agents plus the fact that they're moving so fast is going to cause a lot of issues with traditional systems.
And just cultural awareness too. I think maybe did it bring to the forefront something that people never really thought about a lot, but it's always been kind of important and ignored?
Yeah, I think you can put like fundamental problems under the rug and kind of deal with it for a while, as long as you're covered mostly. And I think with agents, it's just exacerbating an issue that we've already had. To your point previously, it's just now the scale and the impact is possibly much worse than we've ever seen. So I think this is the nuance and the challenge is if you really think so. The world that I live in tends to be one where I think that most of your organization is going to be run by AI agents eventually. One of the concepts I've had, and I've been like working with other folks to develop, is this concept of how do you measure your organization's sort of automatic processes and agents that are running on behalf of the organization? Can you like normalize that to a number from 0 to 1, where like maybe today most of your processes are human oriented, so it's a 0, but if one is like fully agentified, what does it look like 5, 10 years from now for your organization as you start to move more toward that 1, if that's sort of your policy, you want to automate more and more and more. And so in that world where you have 80% of your sort of activities happening under the scene by agents that are autonomously doing things, discovering other agents, you don't have the time to really have a human go and review everything and make sure you're covered. So this is where you need continuous testing, you need continuous risk discovery, you need a lot more different systems than what we've traditionally had. And I think just before we were able to sort of bucket that with humans being able to monitor it, so we were able to kind of cover better than we are going to be able to down the road. I'm curious to your guys' thoughts as well.
Yeah, Ray, what are your thoughts? Why is AI breaking IGA?
Why is AI different, right? The governance theaters, and come back to that line, which is that we have that 0 to 1 spectrum you just talked about. What are the salient differences by which governance is different than people? Well, the first couple of things they're not people. Even interns have liability, and we know how to locate that. And so all of our governance mechanisms are based on eventually tracing back, blame, right? Maybe blame free for a postmortem, but generally if it's a policy violation, it's a blame this. So they're not human in terms of responsibility. Secondly, they're not human in terms of moral responsibility. They're not human in terms of moral imagination either, because we're kind of used to maliciousness. It says, I'm going to file a fake expense report in order to get more money. It's not going to file a fake expense report to maximize the number of like carbon credits that I'm giving to some charity because I think that, you were going to a conference that helps people protect the environment, right? AI autonomous decisions by agents may go wrong for motives you haven't even made very explicit. And third, of course, the speed access, right? So another test one is that there are policies that might have been fine because you could catch them in time, but now they're doing real-time settlement, or they're going to the blockchain and there's no recourses. So if the issue is that the 0 to 1 access, what it makes governance different for people than for autonomous agents, one is it's software, so it's really hard to locate the blame. It's even more diffuse than ever before, and therefore liability and moral responsibility. It's very hard to predict how they're going to fail, because governance is often based on how would a wily human with the mens rea take this corporate policy and follow that governance rule or not, or let their friend in for the door access badge to come to the cafeteria and have lunch. Speed issue, which is that you might have a policy that before, but now it's unworkable if the damage can be done in a much faster cycle time. And I'm sure there's going to be more, or you've certainly thought even more about it, but you should always work backwards from saying, hey, our governance rules for people are just theater when we're applying into these human plus AI hybrid systems, because we're not addressing these 3-4 salient changes that have happened.
Can I add one point here, and then Mike, I'd love to. So just real quick to Rohit's point, like I do think a lot about what is the user experience. Like you have people still running in these organizations, and they're going to have these massive amounts of agents running under them. What does the UX look like for them, right? And how does it? When do they get engaged? How do they get engaged? Are they, when they're deriving policies, are they writing lines of code saying these are the policies? Are they, clicking buttons saying, "Hey, we're going to auto approve this," right? So what does that look like?
Optimus Racer says that the future experience of managing a fleet of AIs is going to be just as awful as the current Slack channel experience managing a fleet of people, except they're going to be hammering you all the time with, "I need help with this. Please press this passkey, approve that." And now you'll be responding with writing little quick rules. And now your bot is going to do this, and you realize that's what happened. It's the same mess as we have right now, but faster, and the risks compound that much quicker. But that's where we have absent some more thinking about governance, right? Because governance is also the process by which a manager chooses to stop answering questions, right? If I can give you a policy that takes something off my plate, that's the security, the ability to sleep at night that Mike talked about.
I actually want to pivot this. because a lot of times when I talk to people about this type of governance, they immediately go to NHI, non-human identity. And to me, that seems like, okay, it took us 20 years to decide that identity wasn't the right way to govern risk for enterprises here. And now we want to take that same approach and extend it into and just treat non-human identity as identity and use that same broken governance process. So to me, it just seems like that we're set up for failure here. But Andrew, any thoughts on why NHI applying traditional IGA to NHI is not, and why is agentic AI more than that too? Why is it more than just a NHI problem or
Yeah, I
challenge?
mean, so there's fundamentally, I think I've talked to people a lot about this, and it's the traditional response or position I get is like it's basically an elevated service, a microservice of some sort, and we can treat it almost as such. I think the big one is if you just launch an agent with no sort of composability across multiple agents, then it kind of doesn't break your traditional models that badly. You do have things like prompt injections and all these other non-deterministic problems, but I think where it becomes really interesting is when the agents start to discover and search for new services basically within their own mesh. And I think that's when it becomes slightly different of a management problem, because all of a sudden your little agent is no longer just in the bounds of its constraints. It's going out and finding new things to go and discover and use and leverage. And we want them to do that because these agents, in theory, this is the point of leverage, that they can accomplish tasks better, right? I talked about policies, right? The field that I was really interested in, this was like 8 years ago, was this kind of multi-agent fleet, partially observable multi-agent fleet scenarios where you have agents that are only observing partial states and they're trying to accomplish tasks. And I do see that happening more frequently as we start to get more advanced with AI. But the thing is as they start to go in and reach out to other systems, they're going to do some really random things that we don't expect. Their combinations are going to break a lot of the existing systems. So that's kind of where my head goes to why this needs new management tools to handle this.
New guardrails.
Yeah, you need guardrails. And one of the great I was at a workshop recently, and we devised basically a matrix where on the left-hand side, it was like a quadrant, and on the left-hand side was like deterministic guardrails versus non-deterministic guardrails. And then on the up to down, it was sort of like explicit access controls. Like you're saying this thing can do this can or cannot do this thing. And then there's like implicit controls. Like sometimes you're just going to want to tell the agent, like, look, I'm not going to hard bound you in this case because it doesn't make sense. I can't like really context it well enough to hard bound you, but I prefer that you don't do these things. And that's like the LLM guardrails you see today versus your traditional like IAM authorizations. And so those are kind of different ways we have to manage these agents, which are unique relative to traditional systems and NHIs. But yeah, that's my personal take. I'd love to hear both Mike, your take, and Rohit's your take as well.
Rohit, why do you think, why isn't NHI sort of provide an answer for governance here? Why is it not enough?
I mean, it's a tool. The unit of governance is still human action, human responsibility, right? Especially if we pull up at the highest levels of alignment and corporate goals. The things that help the CEO sleep at night are that interns aren't leaking customer data from production. That means I'd rather have interns not have access to production user data. They should just do their work with the test orientation.
Can I put a thumbtack and just pause you there? Is it really that the intern is not doing that? Or really no one should be doing that, right? Why does it matter who it is? So isn't really production data isn't leaked? That's the thing. Who cares who does it?
That's great as an example of the higher order lattice. But then if I do that, I have a usability versus security trade-off, because if I make it so that user data in production doesn't leak at all, which again, the largest FANG companies might be a really high shibboleth, it means you have to do the corresponding processes and corresponding exceptions. So now even a senior full-time engineer can't debug that one person who put little Bobby tables in the passport name field, because they're not allowed to look at it at all until Bobby calls in, has a support ticket, has given
the important context of the policy, right? Production data is not modifiable unless, and then you list the exceptions. So you're right. The exceptions are the policy.
That's what the smell is, right? If you're kind of tracking down, where's the policy in our company? Follow the exceptions. Where's that Slack channel where they keep appealing things? That's telling you the right direction. But yes, there's a hierarchy from like, don't embarrass the company is easy to write as a constitutional rule. Don't create legal liability for the company is clearly another higher goal, like or some kind of data subject leak. But as we get down towards rules that are more workable, like interns shouldn't look at production user data, you're still pretty far from something usable as governance today. I can get a number of tools that, like a Drawdower, Secure Frame, or Vanta, or the next generation of companies that will inspect my code, inspect my cloud environment, and write a wonderful document that I can read in PDF that I can give my auditors. It says, today, your production data is covered 6 ways from Sunday, and these people touch it, and these NHIs, and this agent. And then when I realized, oh, shoot, that includes interns, I can't hit backspace over that, delete that line of the report, and then say, go make it so. You know, you don't have a governance engine that goes the other that says, given policies in English, fix the system. And that's where we come down to the NHIs, is that even down to the level interns, we still talk about an individual person. Now, they write some coding agent. It takes a prompt injection attack. What have we just done? That's where the surface really changes. And Andrew's original point about how does NHI on this new axis creating new problems, and bring up like people try of Samuel Center, so on that. The moment you have data and autonomous decision making and access to output data, then that's harder. And that's where governance comes into play, because we aren't giving it hard and fast rules anymore. We have to persuade it in some ways. Sorry, that's never seen higher order policy and an absolute. You're not allowed to send data outside this domain, and hope that the agent now can no longer do as much harm.
I guess I'll take a stab at this one and say, just put my cards on the table. And NHI, so we need a process to govern human identity. We have joiner, mover, leaver. So we need to do that hygiene. It makes sense. But in my opinion, the whole orientation of NHI is incorrect, because we're thinking about entitlements or permissions. I have an identity. What are the entitlements of that identity, and how will I manage that? And I think that orientation doesn't really scale. And so while it's important that we have ways to register, discover, and authenticate non-software, and we have various strategies for doing that, using SPIFFE and OAuth and Whimsy, and other mechanisms. And while I think that we need better discovery mechanisms for agent, I wonder if federation or OpenID federation might not provide sort of an answer for how we could register secrets for entities, software entities, and metadata about those entities. So I'm not saying that I don't think NHI, that thinking about how we give identities to software, I think that's important. But I think that if we think we're going to top-down govern identities based on software in the same way we govern identities based on humans, we'd be taking one broken system and we're failing miserably at, and we would fail even more miserably by doing it with software identities. And we'd probably end up delegating that to some AI, and I think we cannot rely on AI for this type of security. We can't have a potential for hallucination. So I love the idea of using AI to give us ideas of things to look at, but we cannot rely on AI to govern for us. Govern means that we're grown-ups and we're taking responsibility. So if I'm the CISO or CEO and I delegate governance to some AI that hallucinates, that's not being a grown-up, that's being lazy. And I need something more solid than that when I go to the auditors and say, my risk is covered. There's nothing I need to disclose on my balance sheet as an off-balance sheet liability, because there's all this risk that I don't know about. So that's my thoughts. Andor?
I do think you'll need AI to increase the management capacity of governance. So like, just to be very, like, my personal take is, you're right. At some point, a human has to, or an organization which is built on humans, right, has to make a decision around their governance positions and posture. But I look at it as eventually it is pretty inevitable that we will have AI helping figure out how to actually push that downstream, because it's just the girth of it. If humans were trying to do it, it would just be way too much overhead. And I think to do that right, you need to give the AI a ton of tools that don't exist today, to context it. So the other thing I think when you talk about automating and
So you're
improving,
saying we're going to have an AI for governance,
yeah.
just like we have an AI for coding, but we can't rely on that agent. So how
Well,
can we
so I mean, you heard a little bit.
govern for us?
I'll give you a little bit of my postures. You heard, for example, you actually did the session yourself about auto formalization with Elena over at Cedar, right? She was talking about how both of you actually were on that podcast or the live stream, and so I could see if you give enough systems in place to guardrail against the AI that might go and hallucinate, they could do most of the work, just like your coding agent can do most of the coding. We still need a human to review the code, right? You would need some systems in place to make sure, first of all, that the AI has enough context and it has enough tools to validate the policies, to make sure they're in alignment. And then at the end of the day, sure, it needs to be driven by human postures. It needs to be make sure, like, the human probably needs to have an approval loop into that. But no, I at least in my perspective, it's pretty hard to think about a system that doesn't use AI to some capacity to translate the human perspectives on policies downstream to actually delegate down to the agents. It's just we can't use
automation with AI though, because we have automation. I'm 100% in agreement that we need automation, because if we have thousands of policies and I want to know, are the things that I held true before still true? I want to know. I want to be able to run an analysis, and the type of analysis that's required is so difficult, it certainly couldn't be accomplished by a human. And so I absolutely want automation and algorithmic proof. I just don't want, I can't trust AI to actually tell me that it's reviewed the policies and you're fine, because I know that it's also told a guy to take a hit of meth so he could finish his Uber drive because his life would fall apart. And so I just feel like there's a disconnect between governance, which is about business, and about really knowing what your risks are. And I feel like the AI could be good for discovery and analysis and presentation. So if we have let's say 1,000 policies, and we can reason over 800 of them, and we have 200 left that we have to manually review, then can AI go and organize them and present them better to me? I'm all into that idea. But I think at the end of the day, I don't see AI as we fundamentally can't trust it, is my feeling for governance.
I think we're agreeing, I know separately from other conversations, about something that needs to be stated more explicitly. There is a language in between the human debates we have over policy and what the computers are doing. There's a reason we don't straight coding to machine binary output, right? We actually use programming languages because someone can go check into GitHub and review it and then track it for evolution over time. Even in vibe coding, we're still using source code of some language or another. We're missing this kind of intermediate language. Now, in the context here of, say, CedarLink, you can look at saying, hey, I can express a lot of things with that process of principle, action, resource, context. The PARC, quadruplet, is a way of talking about RBAC, ABAC, REBAC, it's NGAC, next generation access controls. Fine, I have a nice abstraction. But that programming language doesn't actually connect up to anything right now, because as in a real enterprise, the chain of software that actually implements the dental pre-authorization policy for this employer for this control is, you can't find the knee bone connected to the hip bone connected to the joint bone. There's a line in the contract that was signed by my employer, and then I, as a person who's being insured, that says I don't get raises or whatever the rule is, and it's something else 75% from the company. That's a whole bunch of spaghetti codes, a lot of different places. I realize to talk about the far future. But this, you don't go straight from natural language or human debate or human laws into something that executes directly, because we'll probably make an error or you probably miss a contradiction or so on. There is a role for an intermediate language. And then intermediate language for the identity side has been LDAP, right? That if I simply keep my eggs in one basket, which is every employee has one and only one ID, hard to establish. We've been through 20 years establishing that. And every employee who has one and one ID, gets shut down when they leave the company. Great. And therefore, they can be members of some groups, and those groups informally end up being the attributes of the role-based access one, that engineers or DBA or on-call SRE. But then I have rules about who can join those. And it turns out I write those in a different language entirely. Who's a manager who can put someone in the on-call SRE group with God mode for the weekend while everyone's out. As we do this, though, but we do realize that it may be right now hard to notice that intermediate language, but there definitely is always an intermediate. We don't go straight from human intention to execution of a machine. And we're going to see, again, hopefully, that's why we're excited about authorization as a way for agents to make it easier to write those languages. Because when we make it tacit, because the transition from human to agent, back to Andor's point about the 0 to 1 spectrum, is going to force us to do this. We're having to take a lot of tacit and make it explicit very rapidly, because the kind of intuition we had about what a turn would do and be put in jail for would allow us to sleep at night and not have to do a lot of governance in writing. Now we have to write this stuff down and in fast, and we have to figure out as a community, what are some new languages to do that in.
We're at 40 minutes. Can you guys go over? Or
yeah, I can go over.
Okay,
we're gonna do 10 minutes. Mic drop there.
It's funny because the title is basically like governing risk in the AI era, and I feel like all we did was talk about govern, and we haven't gotten past that. But I wanted to float one more idea about the breaking function, because I said the breaking function is AI and agentic AI, but maybe the breaking function for governance was actually federation itself. Like when we talk about IGA, we're generally talking about workforce and employees. And the whole IGA industry has been sort of in denial about any other domain outside itself. You might have a contractor, but they still sort of like add them internally and entitle them internally. So maybe the thing is that actually IGA was not federated to begin with, and it's federation that breaks. And why AI really breaks traditional governance is because it pushes federation as a requirement. That there will be other domains out there. The agent is maybe from a different domain and is less trusted. And maybe it's interacting with other agents or other MCP servers that are in other domains. So I don't know, Andor, any quick thoughts on that?
I do see, there's this concept of agentic web that's been playing around a few different places, including Project Nanda and a few other spots. We have the coming in this month, the Agentic Internet Workshop at Computer History Museum on the 24th that will be talking about this as well. I think, it's so interesting because within DIF, we kind of made this realization that decentralized identity has been generally struggling in terms of adoption over the last 20 years, just because federation works really well in a lot of situations, and decentralized identity adds a lot of overhead in some cases for folks. And then what we've realized is this agent thing is kind of like the catalyst, right? This is where we're seeing to establish cross trust boundary agent communication for particularly things like commerce and everything else. You're not going to have the entire world in a federation. You need to have some decentralized infrastructure. And so I think my personal take is this is the moment that decentralized identity becomes popular is when we want to start to do multi-trust boundary interactions between agents. So that's
because you're jumping federation into decentralized, and you're saying maybe
you'll have federation still.
The technology. Maybe there's an opportunity to leapfrog the technology and go straight to decentralized.
Yeah, well, I think there will be some federations, but I think that for these multi-trust boundary interactions, we will need some decentralized infrastructure. I struggle to see how at scale agents, if you're really talking about the agent economy at scale over the web, the reason why the internet has been so awesome is partly because anybody can connect to it across the world, and it you can just reach out, and there's no implicit federation within the internet itself. Obviously, there's DNS, which is, I guess, the lowest level that you can think about the federation. But I do think as we start to scale up agents, DIDs will become more popular, and you will have internal federations, but that's not going to have to expand past your trust boundary. It's mostly going to be internal governance, not external governance. At least that would be my hope. But we're figuring this out. So I think that's why we need to get everybody together and continue to work on this, because I could be wrong, obviously.
IAW and the agentic workshop. I bet you at least half the sessions at IAW are about agentic stuff.
Yeah.
Ravi, make this the last question. So what are your thoughts? What do you think about the idea that federation maybe is the thing that breaks governance, and should have broken it a while ago? And then I guess we'll have to wrap.
Well, I mean, my wrap-up thought is, as an economist, it's another half of my back, the classic firm size theorem of Coase's, Ronald Coase's. A firm exists because it's cheaper to coordinate resources inside the firm and compete as a whole than to disaggregate every single function. And of course, as we've been seeing in this pendulum of the internet economy, things get dispersed. And so now you have lots of individual people doing gig work as drivers, and things get centralized again. So we've got only a couple of commerce vendors that we may not have predicted. Governance has the dual, it's accountability out. That may be where this problem lies, because if it's all inside the company and all human identities, and the agents are being run by employees, well, ultimately I can use technologies to taste each key issuance and do the provenance tracking and loop it back to a single human and say, that customer service agent used this agent to then make the wrong refund, and I'm going to put it on their permanent record. But the whole point is that you outsource things to another contractor by saying, well, you hired someone else to go do your customer service rep, or someone else is doing refunds and responses. Every time you add that, you have another layer of coordination. You now have to explicitly write down the governance rules for that contract. If we keep atomizing companies down to the point where there's just only a few employees in each company, they're going to have to write a lot of governance to make up for that. And so that's an example where the metaphor works in terms of outsourcing and decentralization and the fragmentation of the company, and the fact that computerization has made it possible for small organizations to be worth quite a bit compared to the 20th century. But now, if we go with that analogy, this is the one time where I might come down the side that anthropomorphization is a helpful metaphor. Anthropomorphization of software is almost always a bad idea, but the realization that, every time you transfer a task, you're also transferring your liabilities, and it means you have a corresponding to govern. And so if we want to break the world of business down into smaller and smaller federated units, we have to build up our capacity from the bottom up too. And we have to make a lot of governance much more explicit than just these once a year audits we do as theater for compliance with the accounting and our regulator.
Yeah, I liked everything you said except making governance and accountability, because I think that's really a trap. I was at EIC last year, and I listened to one of the keynotes. I think it was a guy from Savian, and he basically said governance is basically knowing who to blame, or it is all about accountability. I don't think accountability matters, because we've been managing by accountability, and it's resulted in an unknown number of breaches and has resulted in zero security. So holding people accountable as a theory of governance, I think, isn't working. And what we actually want to do is reason over the maximum service.
The whole, accountability for individuals is just witch hunt. Accountability with authority.
Yeah.
I have no way of preventing these things.
Yeah, exactly. It's a hitting coach example. Andrew, last thoughts? I'll give you last thoughts before we break.
Sure. I think I hope people join the Agentic Internet Workshop, to be honest, because I think it is a pitch, but also I think we do need neutral ground to talk about this stuff. One of the things that I see a lot is we struggle as a community in the AI agent space to find neutral spots. So generally, it's hosted by a single vendor, or it's pretty rare that you get a spot where it's just hey, let's work on these problems together. So please join us if you're around. And I look forward to having future conversations, because we're all trying to figure this out, and it's just good to get to talk about it with others. So that's my call to action, and that'd be my one call out.
It's about 2 weeks now, right? IAW and Agentic Workshop.
Yes, and so I think the big thing we're trying to do is get more of a distribution between both identity but AI people specific as well, because I think those are the folks so if you come from the AI background, generally there's been much less work done on standardization. It's a different field. There's a different posture around some of this stuff. So I think bring them over to understand, hey, we need to coordinate around this stuff. This is how we're going to make things open.
Nice. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that, staying the whole week. Awesome. Next Thursday, the C-Suite Guide to IAM Advisory, diving back into identity enterprise stuff. Thank you guys for jumping on such short notice. I think I asked you like 1.5 days ago, so really appreciate it. And Rohita, thanks for jumping on the road.
Well, I
And
especially am excited to see how this conversation for a few weeks and months from now, things like the workshop and so on. It's exciting to have the opportunity. Thanks for talking this through as it's happening. But I hope we'll have new language and better ways to talk about this even within the next few weeks.
awesome.
Yeah, Mike, are you going to throw a session at AIW?
I don't know. I've been not doing as many sessions recently. I like to listen, but I might do some session. I don't know. I have to think about it. I would like to. I'm interested in promoting this idea of a new model of governance that's not identity governance. And we didn't get a chance for you to throw any dirt at trust governance. So maybe at IIW, I'll give you that chance, and you can tell me. Like I said, trust doesn't mean anything to anybody. It means different things to anyone, which means it means nothing. So I understand the aversion to it. But yeah, okay. Well, I hope everyone who can join with the all of the flight government shutdown delays, international travel. I know everyone can't make it, but if you can make it, great. I think it'll be a really interesting IAW this year, and you'll be able to say you were there at the first internet agentic workshop, which will be bragging rights in the future.
100%.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, guys. And I'll